In this lesson, we will be implementing customizable player names and a real-time chat system. We have a server and two clients, where each client can choose a unique name for their player. I'll name the first client's player John and the second client's player Charity 2. When the Enter key is pressed, an input field appears, enabling the clients to chat in-game. I've made it so that the chat text fades away with time. Before we get into the tutorial, I have to explain some core concepts like always. Note that we will use two packages from Unity's asset store, the joystick package and .tween. We will use the joystick pack to control player movement and rotation, while .tween will handle fading the chat text 5 seconds after the server receives a new message. If you're having trouble with this tutorial, feel free to watch the previous two lessons for more clarity. We will have two joysticks. The first joystick will handle movement, while the second rotation. After making two fixed joysticks inside the scene, we will need to get their references in the player script. To do this, we use GameObject.find followed by the names we gave them inside the scene. Note that the names are case sensitive for the find function, and there should be no extra spaces at the end of the name. The fixed joystick has four properties we will use: horizontal, vertical, input.x, and input.y. When the snap x and snap y are set to true on the component, the values for horizontal and vertical will never be 0.7 or -0.2. They will always be limited to one of these three values, 0, 1, or -1. The horizontal property gives a value of 0 when the joystick is centered, a value of 1 when moved to the right, and a value of -1 when moved to the left. The vertical property also gives a value of 0 when the joystick is centered, a value of 1 when moved up, and a value of -1 when moved down. We will send the horizontal and vertical values from the clients to the server, which will then use these values to move the player on the server. Unlike the vertical property, which is restricted to -1, 0, and 1, the input.y value ranges from -1 to 1, depending on how far the joystick is moved up or down. It gives a positive value when moved up and a negative value when moved down. The input.x value is also a range from -1 to 1, depending on how far the joystick is moved left or right. It gives a negative value when moved right and a positive value when moved left, which is the opposite of the horizontal property. This is why we will multiply input.x by -1 when setting the rotation, ensuring the character faces right when the joystick is pushed right, instead of having the character face the opposite left direction. Now that I've covered the joystick pack, let's move on to explaining .tween. In .tween, a tween is a time-based transition between two values. For example, we can create a tween to smoothly move a GameObjects transform along the x-axis from a position of 20 to 70 over the course of 2 seconds. In this tutorial we will have a single tween that transitions from a value of 1 to 0. The code for the tween looks like this. Every time the client sends a new chat message to the server, we will kill the previous tweening and start a new fade out from 1 to 0 over the duration of 5 seconds. .tween has three methods that we will use: onStart, onUpdate, and onComplete. The code inside the onStart method is executed right before the tweening starts, and the code inside the onComplete method executes when the tweening is over. The code inside the onUpdate method executes continuously while the tween is active, with the float value in the tween gradually transitioning from one value to another during the process. In this tutorial, we'll use the float value inside the onUpdate method to gradually fade our text from fully visible, alpha 1, to completely invisible, alpha 0. The code will look something like this. We use a boolean in the onStart and onComplete methods to ensure that newly connected clients don't see old messages fully visible when they should be hidden. To address this, an RPC is sent to everyone continuously, setting the alpha value to 0 whenever the boolean is set to false. This ensures proper synchronization of message visibility across all clients. Now, Let's discuss how we assign the player name within the tutorial. I have a player with a world canvas attached to it which has two Text Mesh Pro text game objects. One for the player name and the other for the chat. The script attached to the player contains a public network variable of type string, which is used to set the text for the player's name displayed in the text object. Before we spawn the player, we set the value of the player name network variable to the text entered in the input field. Before we move forward, I'd like to discuss how we can prevent a client from spawning more than one player for itself. To do this, we'll first check if a player has already been spawned for the client clicking the Spawn Player button before allowing a player to be spawned for it. To achieve this, we will use Unity's Find GameObjects with tag method to get an array of all the current players in the game. We can then loop through this array to check if any player has been spawned with the client's local ID. If no player is found with the matching local client ID, we will proceed with spawning the player. Now, I'll explain how I made an input field appear on the screen when a client presses enter, and then have it disappear after sending the message from the client to the server when enter is pressed again. We use the old input system to check if the enter key has been pressed using getKeyDown. When enter is pressed, we first check if the input field is not already active. If it isn't, we make the input field visible and activate it so the player can type their message. If instead the input field was already active, we send the message to the server via an RPC, clear the input field, and deactivate the game object, the input field again waiting for the player to click enter again to repeat the process. Now let's start the tutorial. First make sure your resolution is 1920 by 1080. Then change the camera's background type to solid color. Now import the Text Mesh Pro essential resources. Open the Asset Store. We will need to get the joystick pack and .tween. Sign into your Unity account. Search for joystick pack. If it is your first time getting this, you will see an Add to Assets instead of an Add to Unity button. Click it. Click Download here, then click Import. For me it just shows import because I have downloaded it before. Now go back to the Asset Store. Search for .tween this time. We need to set up .tween now. To do this, open the utility panel, then click the green Setup .tween button. Click Apply. Now open the Package Manager if you have not already and search for Netcode for GameObjects inside the registry. Change the scene name to Game. Now make a button. Name it the Start Server button. Change its text to Start Server 2. Make the button's width 300 and its height 120. Bolden the text and make its font size 48. Now duplicate the button and rename the new button to Start Client button. Change the text to Start Client as well. Duplicate another button and rename it to Spawn Player button. Change its text to Spawn Player. Then change its font size to 40. Select all your buttons so we can anchor them. Hold Shift and Alt on your keyboard, then click the top center anchor. For some reason I made a 3D project instead of a 2D one, so I'll have to navigate to face the buttons the right way. Arrange for the buttons to be side by side. This looks good enough. Now make an input field for the player name. Rename it to Player Name Input Field. Make its height as long as the buttons. Put it to the left of the buttons. Change its placeholder text to name. Change the alignment settings of the text to the middle center. Now select the text object as well and make it bold and change its alignment to middle center as well. Change the placeholder and text font sizes to 40. Now make an empty game object and rename it to Scripts. Add a script to it called UIManager. Open the script in your IDE. Delete everything. We will only need an awake method. Add the Unity Engine.UI namespace and then make 3 serialize field button references. Name the references Start Server button, Start Client button, and spawn player button. Add the Text Mesh Pro namespace and make a input field reference. Name it player name input field. Make the listeners for the buttons and keep them null for now. Make a spawn player method. Use a lambda expression inside the listeners. We will write the logic for starting the server and client. Add the Unity.Netcode namespace and change the class to inherit from network behavior. We will need a network object reference for spawning the player prefab. Let's make a player now. Since I made a 3D project instead of a 2D one, I cannot directly make a circle sprite and will make an empty game object instead. Name it player. Add an empty game object child to it and name it body. Add a sprite renderer to the body. Choose a sprite you would like the player to have. Make sure your player is at 0, 0, 0 for the transform position. I will change to use the circle sprite. Change the size to your liking. I will make mine smaller. Now make an empty game object for the body and rename it to eye. Add a sprite renderer to it and then select a sprite suitable for the eyes and change its color to black. Resize the eyes so they are appropriate. Move the player to 100 for the X and Y position so we do not see any weird logos on the object. Move the eye up and then change its sorting layer to 1 and duplicate another. Now add a script to the player and name it player movement rotation. Open the script in your IDE. Add the Unity.Netcode namespace and change the class to inherit from network behavior. Now delete everything inside it and make a serialize field transform body reference. We will need to make one more script. Name it PlayerUIManager. Open the new script. Add the Unity.Netcode namespace and change the class to inherit from network behavior. Delete everything and make a public network variable reference. Make it so only the server can change its value while being readable by everyone. Now go back to the UIManager script. Let's make the logic for spawning the player. Since our player is at 100 for the X and Y position, we will need to reset its position to 0. Make a uLong parameter for the client ID. Give it the RPC send to server attribute and add an RPC suffix to the method's name. Add the Unity.Collections namespace. We will be using a fixed string parameter. We will only allow the name to be 10 characters long. Now let's change the player name network variable's value to the player name received from the client. Make it a fixed string network variable. Let's make it so each client can only have one player and no more. Make sure to tag your player correctly. We will loop through each player to check its network object ID, so if a client has already spawned one for itself, we will not spawn another for it. Now make the buttons uninteractable after starting either the server or the client. And if a client connects, we will make the spawn button available. Make the spawn button uninteractable in the scene. Let's also make the character limit for the player name input field 10. Making a character limit integer is better instead of having to write 10 twice in the script. Now change to the movement and rotation script so we can make the fixed joystick references. Add a fixed joystick to the scene and change its position to 200, and then duplicate it and change the new one's position to 1700. Rename the second one to rotation joystick and the first one to movement joystick. We will use GameObject.find to look for the joystick references. Make sure you write the same name that you choose inside the scene. Now make an update method and an isLocalPlayer boolean if statement. Double check that the names in the scene and inside the script are the same. We need a vector 3 movement input from the client to make it move on the server. Now make an RPC method to make the player move on the server. The RPC method will receive the movement input. Now make a rigid body reference and a float speed value so we can add velocity to the player. Let's also make the rotation the same way. We need to make the input value public in the joystick script. Make sure no rotation happens when the angle is 0. Now make sure you get component the rigid body. Let's now make the player UI script. Start by making an onNetwork spawn method. We will use it to set the player name when a client connects to the server. We will need a text mesh pro UGUI reference, so let's add the namespace for it. Now we need another text mesh pro reference as well as another network variable for the chat. We will need to edit the chat's alpha value, so we will need a canvas group reference. We will also need an input field to allow the player to change the chat text. GameObject.find doesn't find inactive GameObjects, so we will find the input field's parent, then use transform.find to find the input field itself. We need an update method to make the chat pop up or disappear whenever we click the return key. We will use the old input system's getKeyDown method. Activate input field basically makes the input field typable as though we clicked it. We will need an RPC method to the server so as to change the chat. We will come back to implement a character limit to it later. Make sure you empty out the input field after the message is sent. Now after the server changes the player chat network variable, we need to display that message on a text mesh pro text object to display the message. We will also fade the chat after every new message. Since we subscribe to the onValueChanged event, we also need to unsubscribe. Now let's make the fade effect. We need a tween reference so the fading never overlaps when a new message is sent and the previous fading hasn't finished yet. The tween will slowly transition the 0 to 1 float here from a value of 1 to 0. We need another network variable to sync the value of 0 to the new clients that didn't get to execute any fading for the chat messages before connecting to the server. Give it a default value of false. We will also need to sync the value of the gradual alpha change to all the clients as well and not just the server. Now let's implement a character limit so that long messages aren't allowed. Now let's add the text references to the player game object prefab. Add a canvas to the player object and make it world space and then make two text mesh pro text game objects on it. One for the player name, the other for the player chat. Make sure the canvas is right above the player. The font size for the player name should be smaller than the font size for the chat. Since the fate is already happening on the server, we do not need an RPC sent to the server. Now add the right references to the right slots. Make sure the chat input field is set to inactive when the game starts. Anchor the objects so that they remain in their place when changing the resolution. Don't forget to change the resolution to 480 for the X and Y in player settings before building. Now then, I fixed some things because it wasn't working. Change these. I will leave the complete scripts in the description of the video.